gentlemen. And what are you here for tonight? You're here for a seminar about the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, and the event is the second event for the year, hosted by the Civilisationists together with the Western Australian Legal Theory Association. My name is Marion, Hercock, for those of you who don't know me, and I do see some new faces here tonight, so I will give you a little bit of background about the Civilisationists shortly. Great to see some familiar faces here. I do the housekeeping side of things. First and foremost, most important, we must acknowledge the donors and the volunteers who have made this evening possible. Without you, we simply couldn't do it. You pay for the hire of the hall, and the volunteers scurry around and organise the food and the seating. Can't thank you enough, volunteers. Now, the other little bit of housekeeping are the exits. Exits behind, and there's also an exit through the kitchen, and there is naturally an exit where you came in. They are signposted. Toilets. There are toilets for ladies, and there are toilets for gentlemen. The ladies is in this hall, behind the pink painted door. The gentlemen, it's in the other hall, the dining hall, opposite the very excellent South African military display, which I hope some of you have noted, and it's behind a blue door. Blue for boys and pink for girls. A little bit old-fashioned at the RSL. Now, the order of this evening. Our first speaker is Professor James Allan, who is a guest speaker from the University of Queensland. Our second speaker is Professor Augusto Zimmermann. After that, we'll have a short break because it's going to be a fairly heavy discussion about the gravity of what we are facing with this horrible bill. There will be some questions. Thank you for sending in your questions. And hopefully there will be some sensible answers to your questions. After which, more refreshments and socialising, and it's your opportunity, if you didn't get an opportunity to bail up or chat to one of our eminent speakers, you'll be able to speak to them then. Civilisationists, for those of you who don't know us, we are part of a worldwide movement of concerned people. We are concerned about the takeover of our institutions by anti-Western ideologies, particularly Marxism and Islam. We are secular, we're non-religious, and we have no political affiliations. But I think some of you might guess which way we lean. Our values include the Western parliamentary democracy, one law for all, equality of race, and the primacy of the family. Now, for the little horror we're going to be talking about tonight. That's what you're here for. That's its full name, and Professor Allan will talk about this in a bit more detail. James Allan is the Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. Now, that professorial chair has been around for about 100 years, and it's the oldest named chair in law at the Queensland University. Professor Allan is originally from Canada, where he has practiced law, and he has lectured in law in New Zealand and Hong Kong, and several other places. His primary areas of research interest, in which he has published widely, are legal philosophy, constitutional law, and bills of rights scepticism. Sounds like a good lad to me. The Garrick Chair was named after a brilliant lawyer and a fine speaker. So too is Professor James Allan.
Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Long flight across from Brisbane. There we go. I can hold one of these. Yeah, free speech is a problem. In North America, you generally start with a joke, and some of you were at the Samuel Griffith, so I won't tell the one I said a couple of days ago. But I was talking at CPAC a couple of years ago, and I trended. I don't do social media, so because I don't want to read what I hear. But I told this joke, and I trended, which was fun when I got to work. But this is the story of the gentleman. He's walking down the beach, and he stumbles on this Arabic-looking bottle, which he picks up and inadvertently rubs. Genie comes in. So the guy looks at the genie and he says, "Do I get 3 wishes?" She said, "Well, you do actually, but I'm a very special genie. So you got to remember, everything you ask for, I'll give you, but every single Green Party voter in Australia will get 2 of whatever you ask for." So the guy thinks and he says, "Well, I could use $1 million." She blinks her eyes, like, "I dream a genie," and she said, "Check your bank account, there'll be $1 million. But remember, every single Green Party voter in Australia now has $2 million in their account. So what's your second wish?" He sort of hankered after one of those high-performance German sports cars. She blinks her eyes, said, "Go home today, in your driveway, you'll see this top-of-the-line BMW. But remember, every single Green Party voter in Australia will have 2. So what's your third and last wish?" So the guy thinks, and he's a pretty canny fellow, and he finally looks at her and he says, "You know, I've always wanted to donate a kidney." Unfortunately, people who went through Australian schools in the last 10 years, you have to explain that joke to them. So look, you know, it's a pretty serious topic, freedom of speech. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview first. Firstly, there's a temptation to think, you know, if we have a Bill of Rights with the American First Amendment, this is going to fix everything. And you can see that that's not true. I mean, I was a big lockdown skeptic. I hated the lockdowns. I think in The Spectator, Ramesh Thakur and I were the first two, and the cost of this is just going to be massively more than the benefits. But at any rate, in terms of thuggery and sort of near authoritarian heavy-handedness and weaponizing the police, one of the retired UK Supreme Court judges, Jonathan Sumption, who is the only one really, said the inroads on our civil liberties were worse than anything we've seen in 300 years. I think that's right. You know, handcuffing pregnant women and weaponizing the police, and I know Melbourne was particularly bad, but there's not a single jurisdiction in the democratic world where a Bill of Rights did anything. So we sort of lived through a real-life experiment. You could have a powerful entrenched Bill of Rights the way my native Canada does or the US does. You could have a statutory Bill of Rights the way the Brits do. Doesn't matter. And that's because when you buy a Bill of Rights, all you're buying is the views of the unelected lawyerly caste.
Yes.
And, you know, people have this view that lawyers are conservative. Well, that was true 70 years ago. You know, donations to political parties are public information in the US. So, you know, 70 years ago, I think the median lawyer politically was to the right of the median voter. Today, the median lawyer is at least a standard deviation to the left of the median voter. And it's not the old-fashioned kind of left-wing political parties. You know, the Dennis Healey British sort of Labour Party or the Hawke Labour Party, where the real focus was on redistribution of wealth. I have a bit of sympathy for that. I don't think they get comparative advantage and efficiency. But today's left-wing political parties around the world are basically, they've moved into being sort of human rights type, social justice parties. And we're seeing a big realignment politically around the world where rich people vote left. And people don't realize that. I mean, Hillary Clinton took... Hillary Clinton took the 100 wealthiest counties in the 2016 election. And Boris, in 2019, didn't take any of the wealthy London seats. It was handed to me off. Right. Is that any better? Is that better?
No, it was actually on. It was.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Right. reminds me of university. I wasn't good at turning anything on. So, rich people vote left. Now that's obviously a generalization. There's exceptions. And it's combined with this social justice attitude to the world. If you go into big law firms, they're about the most woke places you're going to find outside of the Canberra bureaucracy. And I mean that literally. And so Bills of Rights did absolutely nothing to cut back on what I thought were disgraceful and often irrational sets of rules. So again, when you buy a Bill of Rights, you buy the views of the lawyerly caste, and the judges were all on board with it. So we had a sort of real-life experiment. And even if you're sort of mildly optimistic that, okay, well, if you're buying a Bill of Rights, you're buying the views of the judges, our side of politics, in the sense that the coalition is sort of supposed to be right of center, they do a terrible job of appointing judges. And this is true of everywhere in the English-speaking world, except for the Americans the Republicans have figured it out. But if you think back to that terrible case, there was a case a few years back called Love, where the High Court of Australia basically said that someone who wasn't an Australian citizen but identified as an Aboriginal couldn't be deported. This was they just made it up. And it was the Labour judges, the Labour-appointed judges who dissented. So, it was the coalition, George Brandis appointees. So this is a really big problem. Again, every single member of the Australian Human Rights Commission during the pandemic was appointed by Liberals. And they didn't say a single word. They couldn't find it in themselves to criticize the Melbourne police when they handcuffed the pregnant women, or when the Victorian police were kicking people in the head. So, that's the problem. We don't even do a very good job of appointing people. And by that, I mean the Liberal Party or the coalition. The E-Safety Commissioner, who's just unbelievable in what she's bringing to the table. She wasn't appointed by Labour, she was appointed by the Liberals. So you have NZYQ, where they brought to bear what I think was a sort of activist understanding of a made-up doctrine called the separation of powers. Again, all the coalition judges signed up to that. So that is a real problem. Now, you need some sort of background idea of what is going on when we talk about free speech. There's various ways to support free speech, right? And I'll just give you the three main ones. The historically oldest way is to say that just by nature of being a human being, you're endowed with these sort of inalienable rights. Thomas Jefferson, these self-evident truths. And that goes way back in the Western tradition through the important Catholic thinkers and Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And so in that way you see humans as entitled to certain treatment just by nature of being humans. A lot of people like that. I don't find it convincing, but a lot of people do find that convincing. Another one is the John Stuart Mill, who was a great, he was an acolyte. His dad was an acolyte of Jeremy Bentham's, and he was writing, he actually had a nervous breakdown when he was about 18, John Stuart Mill, editing Bentham. Bentham he had some good ideas, but he didn't know how to write. And just trying to edit him caused him to have a nervous breakdown. But John Stuart Mill wrote a famous book called On Liberty, and his argument for free speech is basically consequentialist. What you do is you say, look at places that give people lots of scope to speak your mind, and look at North Korea or places that don't, and you get way better outcomes. And so the benefit of free speech is that in the cauldron of competing ideas, you're going to do better at getting towards truth, because everyone thinks that they know what the true answer is. But, we all make mistakes. And on high-level moral issues, really, what are the odds that after, 4 billion years of life on Earth, you are the pinnacle of moral evolution, right? So your moral antennae vibrate at just the right godly frequency. So everyone thinks they're right when they make moral arguments or political. But, there's a really high chance that on some issues you're going to be wrong. And Mill's argument was, you have to have a cauldron of competing views. You're going to always have a better chance of getting closer to what the optimum or the right answer is. And so, relatedly, but a little off topic, when anyone tells you science is settled, I used to teach the philosophy of science. It's never settled. It's always an open debate about, who might come up with a better idea. For 250 years, everyone thought that, Newton had nailed it, and it turned out at the subatomic level he got everything wrong. Einstein came along. Or another example is people used to think that if you had an ulcer, it was from stress. And he was an Australian who figured out it was actually bacterial. Right. You just never know. The fact that a lot of people agree just tells you that a lot of people agree. It's an indication. And so you should always be open, and you should always, this is the Mill argument, you want the people to sort of duke it out. And if your arguments are powerful, you're not afraid of other people sort of disagreeing with you. And that is a powerful tradition in the Western canon, that argument for free speech, that's the Mill one. It's not related to some sort of claim about us being sort of godly creatures who have special entitlements. It's just look around you and look at societies that afford people lots of scope to speak their minds, the ones that don't. These ones end up discovering jet airplanes, and they end up having people who are a lot happier because they have scope to speak their minds, and those are oppressive regimes, and it's a powerful argument. I think the best one, though, is Larry Alexander's. He's an American guy. He says there's lots of arguments for free speech and lots of reasons for supporting it, but the most powerful is just a flat-out distrust of government. Because, sure, there can be lots of harms with free speech. Nobody likes being called names. You don't need free speech if someone comes along and says, "Oh my God, you're a clever fellow, Jim, and you look like Brad Pitt." And, I don't want to suppress that kind of speech, right? If people are saying things that you want to hear, you don't need free speech. You need free speech in order to allow people to say things you don't like. And the problem with allowing government to step in and start policing things like a fence or anything else is that, government's more likely to make things worse than allowing people to say things. Of course, sometimes people are going to say things that are really nasty, and that's a harm. But trying to police them is a harm too. And everyone just imagines that, well, the alternative to this harm is some sort of perfect outcome. It's not. We're human beings. We're always in the game of picking the least bad outcome. There's never a perfect outcome. There's no perfect voting system. There's no perfect spouse. I only say that because my wife's not here tonight. There's no perfect anything. You're always in the game of least bad outcomes. And so allowing government to have lots of powers to police speech is very, very dangerous. Now, obviously, there's always some limits we're going to put on speech. I think I'm the most pro-free speech law professor going. Maybe Augusto will disagree. I challenge people to mud wrestle. So far, I'm still winning. I only challenge women. No. But you have this real fear of government overreach, and it's a real fear, and we've seen it. And so, yes, we almost all of us would say we're not going to allow anyone to stand up and counsel violence, right? Incitement of violence. The American First Amendment has got the most constitutional guarantees of speech in the world, and they put lots of limits on speech in the U.S. You can't counsel violence, you can't deal in kiddie porn. There's all sorts of things you can't do. So you got to remember, free speech, even in the constitutional jurisdiction with the most protections, there's lots of limits on speech. So we're always in the game of trying to make things a little bit better. Excuse me. This is purely medicinal. I want you to know it. Okay, so those are the sort of main three reasons for supporting free speech. And people can pick and choose, and there's elements of all of them. We are living right now in a time when there's lots of threats to free speech, unfortunately. There's direct attacks, there's indirect attacks. Direct attacks. Well, I was very disappointed when the Liberals under Abbott did not try to repeal Section 18C. Hate speech provision is bad. It's bad, and it's still bad. it's you know, is it as bad as what we're seeing in Europe? No. Is it as bad as some of the laws we see in Canada? No. But it's still nothing to be celebrated. And again, Mr. Abbott should have put that to the Senate, in my view. If they blocked it, fine. Yeah. But he should not have capitulated. And the problem with conservative parties around the Anglosphere is they capitulate on just about everything. They do not fight the culture wars. And I'm sort of the view of Mark Stein that everything's downstream of culture, right? So if you just give up on what's in the school curriculum, you're just going to lose in the long run. Or if you allow the law schools to become sort of factories for social justice, left of center views, which they are, these are the places that are producing tomorrow's lawyers and the day after that's judges. So these are arguments you can't afford to sit out. The ACMA bill, which was put up there at one point. How many people know that the first iteration of that bill was brought to you by the Liberal Party? My God, just shut down every time they have an idea in that party. Please be quiet. So the ACMA bill was first mooted by Paul Fletcher, when he was the minister. It was during COVID, and again, you know, the Libs transmogrified themselves into a thuggish party during the lockdown saga. It's even more. I mean, if you leave aside deaths, we can argue about deaths. I think there's not really very much evidence that lockdowns even saved any deaths. Cumulative excess deaths, you can gain cumulative excess deaths, depends when you start counting, when you stop counting, but it's less able to be gained because when you start counting COVID deaths, with COVID, because of COVID, you know, it's a bit like counting vaccine deaths. You know, when are you counted as vaccinated, when aren't you? And the government likes to count you as unvaccinated after you've had 1.5. You know, it's just crazy the way they measure these things. But you can't. It's harder to gain cumulative excess deaths. So effectively, what you do is you look at a country. You ask yourself how many people died from 2015 to 2019. You average it out, so you get an expected number of deaths. And then you look from the very first day of the pandemic till now, you see how many deaths there are, right? And yes, you can game when you start counting and when you don't, things like that, but it's much harder to game. And, you know, it's not much of an argument to say, well, we saved X number of deaths from COVID, but we got 5X deaths from suicides, alcoholism, missed cancer checks. Right. If you're in the game of counting deaths, then it's deaths. You can't really. There was this great cartoon during COVID. I don't know if it was Jonathan Leake or somebody else, but they had a picture of heaven and the lineup of people getting in because they died, and the heart lineup, the heart attack, and the cancer were huge. And then they had this red carpet and a few people wandering in because of COVID. And again, the average age of COVID deaths in most countries is higher than the life expectancy. So these are people who are already past the life expectancy. So I had real problems with that. The ACMA bill being brought to you by the Liberal Party because it's an earlier iteration, because they panicked. So it deals in these, they like to use jargon. By that I mean, what you could just say is, I think you've said something that's false and will lead to bad consequences. Instead, you confuse people by using the sort of jargony terminology you'd find in a university seminar. So misinformation is basically the idea, it's the claim that what someone said or published is wrong and is likely to lead to bad consequences. That's misinformation. If you put a D in front of it, so it's a nice sort of mnemonic, disinformation, the D is for deliberate. If you do it deliberately, so you knowingly set out to say something that you know isn't true, that's disinformation. Now, I'm just giving you the definitions, right? And by the way, one of the world's leading epidemiologists had a bit to do with Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford. To this day says the biggest source of both misinformation and disinformation during the pandemic were governments.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of it was inadvertent because they panicked or because they decided that they would take advice, you know, from a modeler at Imperial College who got everything wrong in his entire life. He got bovine spongiform encephalopathy wrong, that's mad cow disease. He got foot and mouth disease. His basic modus operandi is to predict catastrophic events that are going to lead to, you know, orders of magnitude more deaths, and then he's always wrong. And this is the guy who influenced both Boris Johnson and the Americans. I don't know why. I mean, again, he was wrong by orders of magnitude. It's just weird how that doesn't affect your career at all. Doesn't matter, as long as you overestimate death. I mean, I'm sure if he had said, you know, X deaths and they came in at X plus 1, or X minus 1, he would have got hammered. So the psychology of it is absolutely bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
But, so that's misinformation and disinformation. In the Voice referendum last year, and Augusto and I were 2 of only 4 law professors in the country who were openly against the Voice. We have a secret handshake we can show you later. Many people know it. 40 law schools in this country, 40, and only 4. I like to say, you know, you can count the number of openly no law professors on one machine operator's hand, and because it didn't hit 5. So there was a body set up called it was an RMIT fact checker, and these are just political organizations, I'm afraid. I mean, everything they fact checked about the no case, they kept saying was wrong, but it wasn't wrong. I mean, I know constitutional law. Right, so you always have to distinguish between facts and opinions. Now, facts can sometimes be debatable. Right. If I say the sun's going to come up tomorrow, there's not a lot of debate on that. But some claims about the empirical world, so you know, we are all people we have reality imposed on us by the external causal world. I mean, unless you're a French deconstructionist, there are facts about the world. You might like them, you might not like them, right? I played varsity basketball in Canada. I'm a little over 6 feet. I was the smallest guy on the team. I hung out with 6'9" guys. That's what I did. I learned how to drink. 6'9" guys can really drink. 6-foot guys can't really drink. It's a fact. But you know, if I wanted to be 6'9", that doesn't make me 6'9". By the way, Canada moved to the metric system except for everything for weight and height, because you're really not part of the civilized world if you say that guy's 183 centimeters. Here's what makes you part of the civilized world. He's 6 foot tall, right? Everyone knows what you mean. It's a standard that the English-speaking world gets. The metric system, you know, it's good for everything except height and weight. Then you just want to be able to. I'm not saying that my kids live in London. I'm not saying that anyone understands stone. I don't know who comes up with a measure where you deal in 14-pound units. But it's good if you want to say what your weight is and you're a little overweight. Only 14 stone. This RMIT fact-checking body just kept saying that everything the no case said was misinformation, disinformation. And on facts, there are sometimes things that you can disagree with on people, and it's not clear what the answer is. You have to wait and see. But on opinions, like I would say, if we had implemented the Voice, we would have got an incredibly activist high court in 5 years, and they would say that's false.
Yeah.
Now, that's an opinion about the future. And I think there's loads of evidence for it, but you know, you can't know for sure. And they would say, oh, you know, Allan's false because people on the expert committee, other constitutional lawyers, had a different opinion. Well, so? Those people were all being paid by the Labour Party, by the way, to be on that expert panel. And they're all left-wing. And they all supported the Voice. And so if you start dealing in claims about misinformation when we're talking about opinions, and again, you know, there's a blurry line between fact and opinion, but it's harder sometimes to argue about someone having a plausible claim when it comes to facts. Well, that was going on in the background. And you know that's going to happen with any misinformation or disinformation body. There's going to be a panel or a person set up who's going to be making claims. A, why would you expect them to get it right? B, we know they're going to be left-wing. C, if the Liberal Party appoints them, they're probably going to be even more left-wing. E, Safety Commissioner being evidence for that. Other problems with this bill is it doesn't define harm, really. And, you know, if you deal in amorphous Olympian abstractions, you just are creating a vehicle through which the point of application interpreter can deliver his or her own preferences, and that's bad. Incredibly, the existing iteration of the bill, it'll probably be changed to some extent, but it exempts governments, the mainstream media, universities. The people who got everything wrong during lockdown, in my view, every single thing wrong, they are exempted. The average person who got a lot of stuff right, you're not exempted. This is heavy-handedness, and it's something that is really bad in my view in the long run. And so it's handing calls to bureaucrats, and again, they are not sort of some kind of neutral gods. Some of the indirect attacks are maybe even worse than direct attacks. You've got this, what do I mean by, indirect attacks? Well, I've never used a computer, so this is making it awkward. You have this thing called the Global Disinformation Index, and they sort of affect the amount of money you can get if you're a television show, you're a podcaster, you go on YouTube, because they effectively, if they deem you to be dealing in misinformation or disinformation, the big corporations who advertise won't advertise. So this is indirect. It doesn't stop you from podcasting. It just means you can't monetize your views. It's really problematic. And it's always a one-way ratchet. You can tell overwhelmingly as people on the, it's conservatives. You get indirect attacks on speech, the National Conservative Conference in Brussels. Excuse me. COVID, I'm going to kill you all. There's collapsing viewpoint diversity on campus. Right, so 50 years ago, lefties outnumbered righties on university campuses, I don't know, 4-1, 5-1. It's way more than that now. There's a study a guy did he was law professor at Notre Dame, but again, if you give money to a political party in the US, that's public information. So he went through all the data on the Federal Electoral Commission. So he looked at every year from 2017 to 2023, I think. And it turns out that Democrat law professors, these are only people who give money. So if you don't donate, you're not captured. But Democrats outnumber Republicans 36-1. I would say something like that. Something like that here. Now, we can make an argument. The people who haven't given money, are they more likely, are leftist-centered people more likely to not give money to political parties, or right-of-centered party people? I personally think leftist-centered people are more likely not to give money, so the figure's probably worse. But that's just raw inclination by me. I don't know that at all. But it is collapsing. And so if you think about it, if you're the kind of person like me who I just can't stand acknowledgement of country stuff, I think it's patronizing, condescending. Nobody who says it actually believes it, or they'd be giving up their house. They don't. So if you actually believe that you should offer someone your house, and so it's a form of virtue signaling, really. It's a cost-free way to indicate to other like-minded people that you're part of the elect, the moral elect, right? I just can't stand it. But so that's a problem. We saw the one-sidedness of the division of viewpoints in Australia in last year's Voice. If you remember, almost every major corporation came out for yes. The churches came out for yes. The charitable sector came out for yes. 40-odd universities, 2/3 of them came out officially for yes. The others were supposedly neutral. Not one came out for no. Some of the ones that came out as neutral ran seminars and symposia that only featured yes speakers. And just about 61% of Australians voted no. My state was the highest no. I just want you retrograde Western Australians to realize that Queensland is better. In fact, you guys came third. embarrassing to come behind South Australia. I'm just going to say that right up front. The biggest problem with universities, if I were fixing them, is I would close down every single diversity, equity, and inclusion department. These people, they want to see the world in terms of groups.
Yes.
So they stop looking at the world in terms of individuals, because individuals have different outcomes. I mean, there's a famous and funny story by the mayor of New York about 40 years ago. He was campaigning and ran into a person and he said, well, you know, here are my 12 policies. And he said to the person, now look, if you agree with 10 of the 12 of those policies, you should vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 out of 12 things, you should go see a psychiatrist. Nobody agrees. If you don't agree with your spouse on 12 out of 12 things. You know, maybe when you're dating, right? That's what I always say in class. If you're in the middle of a heated, you know, if you're in a discussion about some controversial moral argument, and someone says to you, well, I used to have the exact opposite view, but you've completely changed my mind. I just can't believe it. Well, it's 100% that person wants to sleep with you. Nobody changes their mind like that, right? You change your mind slowly, gradually over time because of new evidence. And I kind of like, I think it was Mark Stein or someone who said, you know, somebody said to him, well, you've changed your mind on that. And he went, yeah. If you've never changed your mind on anything, the problem is you. Yes. Right. No, you don't want someone who's changing his or her mind on things every day. The Peter Ritt decision, another horrible high court decision. I want to leave time for questions, so I might just wrap up. But this is a bad bill. I didn't particularly like the digital ID bill. That was bad too, but you know, right now we haven't got an effective opposition. But we're getting close to the election, so I have some hope that Labour might not go forward with this. It's important. I don't know, are there any late Liberal politicians or party members? Well, anyway, talk to your member, because however bad the Liberals are, they are the best hope we have to block these sorts of things. Now, I'll hand over to Augusto, and then we'll take questions after Augusto. I'm not being rude, I'm going to go get a beer. But let me thank everyone who spends their time to come to these sort of things. You're making the world better, and I want to thank you. I spent at least 2 weeks practicing my Canadian accent for tonight, so you can believe my content.
Questions later are relevant, most appropriate. I'm now going to introduce someone who actually needs no
Microphone is off.
Someone who actually needs no introduction. My learned friend, Augusto Zimmermann. He is Professor and Head of Law at Sheridan Institute of Higher Education in Perth. Augusto is the founder and president of WALTA. That's the Western Australian Legal Theory Association, our partner. He is a well-known champion of the West and of our freedom of speech.
Just to grab my glasses. Just 1 second. I need glasses. Thank you very much. It's a privilege, a pleasure to have your presence here, and the presence of my son, Gabriel. My son is here with me. Not working? How about? Hello?
Yes.
Right. So now it's working. It's James' fault, not mine. But I'm really delighted to have James Allan here, a good friend of mine, one of the last of the Mohicans in the legal profession. Together with me, we are not the rule, we are exceptions to the rule. But I guess that when I was at Murdoch, I I must say, you have probably the same experience at the WA, the laziest academics tend to be left-wing. So that's good, because I would do more work to our side than they would do to their side. The only problem is that I was one and they were 100, so that was a difference in this sense. But what I have to say, James is always brilliant, and I'm very disappointed, man, that I'm the second speaker, because it would be very hard now to be not so boring, because I don't want to be so. I had a paper. I actually took my afternoon to write a paper on the subject. So I have something to say that it's potentially a little bit different from what Jean has stated. So I hope that I will add something new to the debate. So the Australian government, as you know, has recently announced its plan to introduce this misinformation. Recently, I would say, because they started the discussion last year, actually. To empower the Australian Communications and Media Authority to force social media platforms to tackle any alleged misinformation. The opposition leader, guess what? He supports the bill, and he is working together with the government to introduce the e-safety laws. We shouldn't be surprised, because past behavior is a good indicator of how these people behave. And you know that the coalition, when it was in government, sought to censor COVID-related content in practice, which in practice amounted to the silencing of dissenting voices. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jim has mentioned that Section 18C. Lorraine Finlay, who is now an Australian Human Rights Commissioner, and myself, and together with Joshua, we wrote a book called No Offense Intended, and unfortunately the book was disconsidered by the dreadful government of the day. It was the Malcolm Turnbull government. So the Federal Communications Minister, just go back to Labour now because both are dreadful, candidly communicates us that the Albanese government has been steadfast in its resolve to combat what they call the scourge of mis and disinformation online. She contends that holding social media companies accountable for seriously harmful misinformation and disinformation on the platforms has never been more important. Important for the ruling classes, of course, not for us. Her department has recently issued a document proposing amendments to the online safety that would deprive Australians of free speech and the implied freedom of political communication. And I know that Jean doesn't like this idea of that's connecting with an interpretation given by the High Court that derived from a constitutional framework. We have such a thing. So the Safety Commissioner's online hate speech report defines harmful content as anything that can increase the likelihood of discrimination. Not surprisingly, neither hate speech nor harmful are actually defined. The concept of harm peddled by the Safety Commissioner's report is basically left to be subjectively determined by an unelected governmental agency. Of course, reasonable people, and Jean has made this point, you have different views about what constitutes harm. For example, most reasonable people, you are in this category, would assume that government's information about mRNA vaccines, they would regard this information as being, that they said, that's if safe and effective, actually constitutes harm and misinformation. However, the government will continue to make sure that official information is never deemed misinformation. It's indeed quite revealing Don't forget the photo, all right? He will take a photo for you, and my son. However, the government will continue to make sure that official information is never deemed disinformation. It's indeed quite revealing that only the views that are incompatible with the official narrative of the ruling classes may be considered harmful and misinformation. Curiously, the Online Safety Act 2021, already enacted obviously then by the liberals, already grants an unelected bureaucrat, namely the E-Safety Commissioner, extraordinary powers to enforce compliance with the Communications Minister's directives. In fact, the President Commissioner has recently used his power to order X, formerly Twitter, to remove material claimed to depict gratuitous or offensive violence with a high degree of impact or detail within 24 hours or face fines. Most correctly, X has accused the Australian government watchdog of global censorship. So we are in the vanguard of this fascist approach. We will robustly challenge this unlawful and dangerous approach in court, X said. The owner of X, Elon Musk, has tweeted that the Australian Censorship Commissar is demanding global content bans. Earlier, he branded the E-Safety Commissioner the Australian Censorship Commissioner, while his company raises free speech and jurisdictional concerns over the takedown order. Not surprisingly, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, not particularly known for his appreciation for free speech, claims that the E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Eman Grant, the American and later imported fascist to be here, is doing her job to protect the best interests of Australia. It could only come from a person like him to make this statement. In her address at the World Economic Forum, mind you, in 2023, the Commissioner talked about the need for the Australian authorities to think about the recalibration of a whole range of human rights that are playing out on line, from free speech to freedom to be free from online harm. It's instructive to consider the circumstances that led to these bureaucratic and legislative attempts to regulate what Australians are allowed to see on their social media platforms. The present frenetic activity to hold social platforms accountable is a direct consequence of the posting of images of the stabbing of Bishop Mary Emmanuel when he was administering a live stream service at the Assyrian Christ of the Good Shepherd Church in Walkley, a suburb in Sydney, following the attack of a person in particular that followed that attack on a shopping center, by the way. That was another accident or incident. But this is actually to protect us from discussing the causes of this. Well, rather than actually addressing the motivations behind, what the government is going to do is to exercise further censorship and also remove the right of citizens to self-defense. So in Western Australia, they are introducing a very draconian gun control legislation, which is basically to make sure that the criminals will be having the activities done more comfortably, if we can say. So in removing such materials, Australia's collective memory will soon forget that this unfortunate event ever happened, thereby removing knowledge of a painful part of our history. In this context, it is helpful to speculate as to what could have happened after the Second World War if the disturbing horror images of extermination camps or the more recent beheadings of innocent people by ISIS, the Islamic State, or the hanging of Saddam Hussein had not been readily available for viewing. The ability of such material on social media is a reminder to the world of the innate evil that people are capable when they have total control over others. In Australia, the government and now also the coalition opposition are arrogating to themselves a patronizing sense of entitlement to a guiding role over the lives of its citizens by banning videos and images that are part of the Australian historical landscape. These are the type of laws adopted by a fascist state that embraces a totalitarian approach, which is authoritarian, and imposes on people what is good for them. It's not the role of the state to hold the hands of adults of full capacity as they make their own decisions, as to what they want to view on social media. It's always imperative to be reminded that every single authoritarian regime eventually undermines free speech, as a matter of course. Indeed, rulers with authoritarian inclinations always had a vested interest in preserving the status quo by suppressing any speech that might threaten their prevailing orthodoxy. For example, in 1621, when the House of Commons in England announced the right to freely speak, King James I tore out the page of the journal which contained the statement and arbitrarily dissolved the Parliament. The king also imprisoned several MPs who were deemed disloyal to him for simply daring to proclaim such a right to free speech, including Sir Edward Coke. History repeats itself. History repeats itself. And now the Australian Communications Minister has been galvanizing support around the globe, talking to Canada, the European Union, the UK, to form a global consortium to bully X and Meta into compliance with the government's censorship requirements. The first step was to sign, on the 20th of February 2024, a memorandum of understanding with Michelle Donnellan MP, the UK Secretary for Science, Innovation and Technology, entitled the Memorandum of Understanding between the Government of the United Kingdom and the Government of Australia concerning online safety and security. This agreement commits both governments to suppress online information under the false pretense of countering so-called misinformation, disinformation, and it goes even to the point of saying that this constitutes a threat to our democracies and social cohesion. So censorship now is a threat to or better say, not having censorship, free speech. Free speech is considered to be now a threat to democracy. This is a Orwellian use of language. Free speech is definitely not a threat to democracy, but rather a core principle every authentically democratic society requires. Anyone who has studied a little bit, not so much of history, knows that protecting free speech is about giving voice to the powerless against established interests. Consequently, free speech should be regarded not only as a democratic requirement, but also as a mechanism against the concentration of power. Furthermore, in a real democracy, anyone should have the right to choose words that best reflect their feelings. And strong words may better convey to listeners the intensity of feeling than more conventional language. The extent to which political speech in Australia can be offensive was considered in a case called Roberts and Bass in 2002. This case dealt with defamatory allegations made against a member of the South Australian Parliament. Justice Michael Kirby argued for the majority of the court that political communication in Australia is often robust, exaggerated, angry, mixing fact and comment, and commonly appealing to prejudice, fear, and self-interest. This argument was considered to be constitutionally acceptable and was further expanded in Coleman and Power in 2004, where the same justice, Justice Kirby, also reminds us that Australia's politics often involves emotion and invective. and that the constitutionally implied freedom of political communication must allow for all of these. But the reason as to why the Federal Communications Minister may be approaching so many international actors and signing this memorandum of understanding with her UK counterpart is possibly, and I would say so, to trigger or activate the external affairs power provision which is found in section 5129 of the Australian Constitution. As the range of topics regulated under the external affairs power has been endlessly expanded, the scope of this head of power presently encompasses any relationship with or between foreign states and foreign or international organizations or other entities, regardless of whether they be subject to international treaties or even it could be less formal dealings or agreements. In paper, Federal Commissioner of Taxation, Justice Bryant observed that the treaty or commitment need not to have the precision necessary to establish a legally enforceable agreement at common law, but it must avoid excessive generality. As such, implementing any international commitment would provide the basis on which the federal government could defend the constitutional validity of this legislation if this was challenged in the court. This reliance on a commitment would only have to be evident from the preamble of the proposed legislation. So a memorandum of understanding would serve for the purposes of triggering Section 5129, according to some Justice of the High Court's approach to the matter. Of course, it's not difficult to understand why so many politicians across the Western world would want to join our politicians in reducing any threat to their own official misinformation, because they are those who will be protected by the legislation. So only there, misinformation, disinformation will be allowable. The horrendous violations of people's fundamental rights over the last years have revealed the existence in Western democracies of an invidious trend to authoritarianism. A perfect example of this trend, of course, is the ongoing discussion in our nation about the supposed need of this misinformation bill or legislation. Free speech, I must say, is under serious threat in Australia, and it behoves all those who truly value democracy to oppose this spectacular power grab by those who aspire to have more arbitrary control, more authoritarian control, and control over you and our society. So it's very important for us to understand that I think the moment is not propitious for them to introduce this legislation after all the instances of oppression and tyranny that were envisaged on our people over the last 4 years. You really need to be, sorry to say, brain damaged to think that the government is here for your well-being and for the advancement of the common good. Ronald Reagan was right. The most scary thing you can ever have in your life is to see someone knocking on the door and saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, I came here to help you. They are never doing that. These people tend to be narcissistic people. Most politicians are narcissistic characters, and they are keen in removing all your rights and freedoms because it's all about power and control. Let's fight to the very end, resist this oppressive regime, and have the full restoration, seeing the full restoration of our fundamental rights and freedoms. Thank you very much.
Yes, Augusto.
You can all have a little break, recharge your glasses, grab something to eat if you haven't had something to eat already, and prepare for questions. Well, we're going to make a start. Just to remind you, what you're here to learn about tonight is the communication, legislation, amendment of questions, many of which were virtually the same. They were very similar. And so we've distilled it down to about 7, and we'll give our learned speakers the opportunity to give their perspective on your questions.
Thank you.
You've had your break. Our first question is, what happens if ACMA declares something is misinformation, and a while later it actually turns out to be factual and true?
I'm really interested in your
Well, as a matter of fact, we've seen that with so much related to the lockdowns, you know. I can remember when the lockdowns first started, if you said that it leaked out of the lab, literally you were called a racist, and you were poo-pooed, and even the former head of MI5 was cancelled for saying that. And of course now the massive consensus that did come out of the lab, which is not all that surprising when you think that, you know, they found it 25 feet outside the front door of the only lab doing this research. A lot of people would say, wow, there's a fair chance of that. So there's probably no consequences. You know, that's the problem with heavy-handedness. If it turns out you're censored or it's deemed to be misinformation and it turns out later it's true, well, you know, that's the problem with these sorts of bills. They pretend that someone has access to eternal, timeless truth and shut off all debate. And you know, it's just not a good way to run society.
Well, we know that real information was suppressed by the government that used the Terrorist Act to silence any dissenting opinions during the worst of the moments of the pandemic. The Scott Morrison actually censored thousands and thousands of social media interactions. I got cancelled, and many others, and now everybody knows I was right and the government was wrong. But you know, that cost lives. So I think, I still hope that this is not going to be the end of the story. I want these people to be held criminally accountable for the crimes they have committed. I'm not going to just forgive them, they have to be punished.
And our next question, if I make a statement on Facebook and it is removed by Facebook, how do I appeal against the company's action, particularly if the ACMA is actually threatening me as well?
You can't. Well, as I said, I don't really do social media. I did get Twitter after Elon Musk bought it because I thought I should, just because, you know, for his faults, it's a bit weird when free speech depends on an idiosyncratic billionaire, but it does, and he's done a pretty good job. Facebook, you know, well, Zuckerberg really has no commitment to free speech that I can see. One of the things is people get mixed up. I mean, in the U.S., First Amendment applies to government, it doesn't apply to private corporations. And so if a private corporation wants to silence you, it can, and you can understand that. I mean, if you take a job with McDonald's, you can't go in and start, you know, waving around a vegetarian billboard, because your free speech is stopping at the place where you start your job. It's a bit like, imagine if you drove for FedEx or something, you could drive to work in your own car with any bumper sticker you wanted on the back, but nobody wants you, when you start driving the FedEx truck, to put political stickers on the FedEx truck. So free speech, to some extent, has to give way to the fact that you're now in an employment section and nobody really wants to hear your views while you're driving the FedEx truck. Bog standard sort of stuff, right? The problem is that we now know that the Biden administration was actually in bed with Facebook and some of the other social media. So it wasn't as if these social media companies were all just making these choices autonomously by themselves. They were not. And so that's a problem. Some of those cases are creeping their way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Right, so we're going to see we're going to see some decisions coming out in the next month. Some of them could be interesting. I did notice that the New York Times took a real run at Thomas Alito for having an upside. He actually was using a George Washington era American flag, and they really took a run at him. It makes me wonder. I have no evidence for this other than speculation, but I'm wondering if they've had leaked to them one of the decisions that probably was 5-4, and they're trying to get Alito taken off. So there's the Trump immunity case. We don't know how that's going to go, but that should be released soon. Some of these cases make you wonder what's going on in the background. I don't really know, but we'll find out in the next few weeks.
And in Australia, James referring to censorship by the American government, putting pressure on Facebook to remove posts that were considered to be against the official narrative of the government. But here in Australia, the Morrison government did exactly the same. And I wrote an article in the Quadrant telling the readers that according to Alex Antic, about 12,000 posts were removed from Facebook by the Morrison government. So we think that it's just that Zuckerberg or whatever, it's not just him, he's being instructed by the government, it was put on pressure to exercise fascistic censorship by this dreadful character that we had as a Prime Minister, in my opinion, the worst Prime Minister we have ever had, called Scott Morrison.
I would say worst Liberal Prime Minister. There's been an awful lot of bad Labour ones.
He has the opportunity, the occasion made him to be, but we never know what's going to happen. That's why they are disarming the population now with the WA control laws. They are doing the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. It looks pretty suspicious. And now they are trying to introduce at the level of the World Health Organization a pandemic treaty. So what do they have in mind? It makes me rather suspicious, I must say.
Now this question touches upon parliamentary privilege. If I quote a politician, and some of us do like to quote Malcolm Roberts from time to time, or Alex Antic, can a CMA declare that that quote is misinformation, even if the politician made the statement in the Parliament?
So parliamentary privilege goes back to the 1689 Bill of Rights. It's not the Bill of Rights for individuals, it's the Bill of Rights for the elected Parliament. And so the judges will not touch stuff said in Parliament. So you can't be sued for defamation. If you stand up in Parliament, you can say whatever you want. And again, we're always dealing with trade-offs in life. The idea is, sure, it might be abused, you might get a rogue politician who says untrue stuff, but on the other hand, there might be some information you want to get out there, and the laws of defamation can make it very difficult to say things. Because remember, in defamation, if you sue someone for defamation, they have to prove what they said was true. And often, there's this big gray area in the middle where it might be true, it might not be true, but you can't prove it. You lose. And so the idea of parliamentary privilege was to allow MPs to be completely unconstrained in what they say. And I don't think judges would touch that. But again, you have to have politicians willing to do that.
It's interesting that politicians are, according to the system that we have adopted in Australia, is the representative government model. They should be our employees. They should be working for us. So the Bill of Rights indeed protect parliamentary speech, but I don't think that they should stop with the protection of free speech for the politicians, because they work for us and they should be removed. But if they are really representing the electorate, why on earth they can express their opinions, and those who elected them, who actually are their bosses. So if you really believe in democracy, we are sovereign. People are sovereign, and not the politician. So the politician represents you, and I think that the same free speech that is afforded to a politician must be afforded for those who elected them.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to challenge that one, aren't we? Another question. Can the ACMA challenge the expert statements which are made by qualified, scientifically robust, knowledgeable bloggers, some of whom are here tonight?
Well, so the way the bill's structured is, it's not the politicians who are going to be deeming something to be misinformation. They're going to set up this bureaucratic body of supposed experts, like the RMIT people during The Voice, and they can deem anything they want to be misinformation, disinformation. In theory, I suppose you could go for judicial review, right? If that's what you mean, if the questioner meant by challenge, can you take legal action against them? You could.
Well, these people will be coming from your universities.
Yes.
Yeah, I just basically have no confidence in anybody put into that position. But if you say, well, what do you do about it? Again, it's always, I mean, if you're Clive Palmer, you'll take a judicial review and you'll spend $1 million to go to court, but most of us aren't going to do that. I mean, the legal system is more friendly to billionaires and highly wealthy people than it is to middle class people, because if you're middle class and you lose, you're bankrupt. And you know, if you're a magnate of some sort, you know, it's the cost of doing business. Doesn't matter. So yes, in theory, there's always judicial review. Any decision made by a tribunal or a bureaucratic body, you can go to the judges, you can go to the Western Australian court system or the federal court system and ask for them to. Judicial review means they ask themselves, the judges, whether this was done with natural justice, and you know, it's a reasonable decision. Very expensive, and none of us in this room, I think, with one or two possible exceptions, are going to take that route.
Yeah. And the judges have shown themselves to be not necessarily reliable, by the way. We even have an example of this judge in Melbourne who had connections in the past with a certain pharmaceutical industry, and she didn't disclose this information. And now, of course, the lawyers are trying to turn the decision into being void ab initio, so not being considered, which is going to be almost impossible, by the way. And another avenue that they are taking is to attempt to impeach her. But what I find it disgraceful is that judges in Australia didn't have any consideration for the Constitution itself, because they used to say that under an emergency power, anything can happen, anything is possible. They ignored very clear provisions in the Constitution. For instance, one saying about referring to medical pharmaceutical prescription. And I have written an article together with a friend of ours, Professor Gabriel Moyes, about this subject. Another thing, Section 92. That's probably the most important clause in the Constitution, because that's the one saying that the borders should be free for interstate movement of individuals and commerce.
Absolutely.
Absolutely free. And the High Court somehow managed to say that absolutely free now becomes relative. So the border should be absolute is no longer absolute anymore.
So they can challenge the experts, the ACMA.
They won't. Very expensive.
And somebody sent in, what is the legal and constitutional validity of our government controlling free speech in Australia? Can the government actually do this?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, they do it every country on earth. I mean, you once you have a government, there's limits. Again, you don't get more constitutional protections for speech anywhere more than you do in the U.S., and there's all sorts of limits on your speech in the U.S. There's many things I dislike about a Bill of Rights, but one of the things I dislike is they deal in these very emotional entitlements in the language of rights, right? You could translate any right into a rule. The right to free speech. There is a rule that in the following circumstances you can speak, right? Rules are desiccated, they're dry. Nobody likes the language of rules. The language of rights just ooze entitlement. So people get this frisson, excitement down their back, and they go, oh my God, the right to free speech, I can say anything. No, you cannot. There's also, what a Bill of Rights does is it says the elected legislatures will no longer tell us what the limits on speech is. these unelected judges drawn from the lawyerly caste will. And so they make the limits. Now, you come into a Bill of Rights thinking I can say anything, or you can't practice anything in the name of religion. There's all sorts of limits on rights. It's just that the elected politicians aren't drawing the limits anymore. The thing about democracy is it's got a lot of flaws, but I'm a Churchillian. Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for everything else. So when people say, well, there's this problem and this problem and this problem, they're usually right. So, what's your alternative? To let a bunch of people who've gone through law schools and have, been appointed to the, you want them making the decisions? Because I don't.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, okay, there's a lot of problems with democracy, but there's a reason why people from non-democracies try to get into democracies. And I don't know too many people trying to get into North Korea. And so, I want the accountability that elections give. It's not perfect. But as we were saying earlier, all the sort of elected thugs who brought us lockdowns, they're all out of office now except for Trudeau and Biden. Right, so at least, we're not going to see them in jail. I want that too, but not happening, I don't think. Fact of life. But I think we can at least vote them out. Trudeau's 20 points behind in the polls in my native Canada. He's going to go, and there's a fair degree of at least possibility that Biden will go too.
There is a problem with concentration of powers in Australia, and Professor Moyes and I, Jean, we started to write an article about executive decrees, delegated legislation, and other sort of things that are in violation, in my opinion, in our opinion. We have just written this article about the undermining of constitutional government in Australia. So if you do my unit that I have passed over here the leaflet, but basically what I believe is that concentration of powers is always a problem. And Sir Harry Gibbs said that the solution is not a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, as Jim is the master on the subject. He really taught me. I actually started to learn more about how bad the Bill of Rights is via his work. So he converted me, and I'm entirely sure that the Bill of Rights is not the solution. But Sir Harry Gibbs thought exactly the same. And he said,
I don't get a lot of.
Not now. The arrangement was for later. But the point is that the best way to actually have the realization of the rule of law and to have the enjoyment of individual rights and freedoms is via a proper system of checks and balances, a proper separation of powers. So the best way is for the powers to be more properly separated. And what I see in Australia is total concentration of powers. And I always like to give the examples of how I got appointed to be a commissioner, a law reform commissioner. I just got a phone call from the Attorney General. And they told me, you belong to the party. I was the senior vice president of the Liberal Party. That's the grounds for me to be appointed a commissioner. Well, of course, he probably regrets even to this very day that he appointed me, because I want to do more than just serving the interests of the party. I wanted to serve the community. And I came from the other side of the world for a purpose, to help you and to help my people here in Australia. So I try to do my best, but I started to realize how they actually appoint people and how they choose people. And it was nothing about my expertise or about my qualifications. It had nothing to do with that. But I would like to see more accountability. I would like to see more of the branches doing the proper job. For instance, the executive branch should be more about the administration of the laws that are made by Parliament. We should have more accountability, and judges should be appointed in a way that's not just being chosen by people who have vested interests. But I don't understand why nobody is talking about this. So I decided to actually write an article just to say that we need to have checks and balances. We need to have more separation of powers. I would not even mind to see ministers who are not necessarily politicians. Why on earth a minister has to be a politician? Why not to have impeachable ministers? Why not to get the best person for the job, and he can be impeached by Parliament if he doesn't do it properly.
Now, gentlemen, how do we convey to the apathetic public, which has been marketed a simple, true, false proposition, a principles-based argument for why this bill will be a bad piece of legislation? You've spoken to the audience here tonight, but how do we get the message across to everybody else?
I just think you just say that, you know, free speech is at the core of Western society, and this is government overreach. And having lived through the last 3 years, do you trust government? Do you trust the people that they're going to appoint? I mean, I think there's been a significant drop in, I think, around the English-speaking world, in people's confidence and trust in the elites. And you can certainly see it in polls in the U.S. I mean, I did a little piece of I ranked who were the worst during COVID, and my view is actually at the top of the, so in terms of the worst were the journalists. And the politicians I would give second worst after the journalists. You're supposed to be questioning and skeptical, and didn't see too much of that.
Yeah.
So, you just have to articulate. Now, I mean, I think there's a sense out there that there's something wrong with this. But again, with only not very much time till the next election, there's hope that we can block this.
Yeah. The Greeks used to have a word for free speech called parrhesia, and that was only applied to those who were citizens. 90% of the population in ancient Greece and Athens who were not citizens, so they didn't have free speech. Free speech is a privilege of free people. So if you do not like or enjoy free speech, it's because this person has the soul of a slave. Only slaves would appreciate the government removing their freedom. So you can say also that free speech is always important for the weak and not for the strong, because those who are in government are those who control everything. They are the status quo, they are the establishment. So if you really want to change things, and if you're not part of the status quo, that's when you need free speech the most. The elites, the oppressors, the ruling classes, they always want to suppress free speech, and the vehicle per excellence of every single totalitarian regime is the removal of free speech. So those who don't support free speech, they are much closer to fascistic and totalitarian regimes than those who value it and support freedom of speech.
What about the apathy, though? Because that's what everyone here would say. We've got this enormous problem with apathy. I rest my case. Now, I think this is our final question. Our illustrious Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, ran the Trotsky Society, that's a communist group at Sydney University. And that society is now leading the pro-Hamas, anti-West agitation at the university. Would, you think, ACMA deem that statement to be misinformation or disinformation?
So, an observational aside, and then I'll answer. So, we have these encampments at my university. It's just awful. There was a little counter encampment of Jewish students. I used to take them coffee every morning. But look, when Khomeini took over in Iran, pretty much the first people he killed were the hardline Marxist-Leninists. So if you think that they're both going to coexist, you're wrong. Probably not. Again, there's a distinction between facts and opinion. If it's a straight-out fact, then I think it's harder. Now, they can try to censor based on it's true, but we don't like the possible consequences, which is what the E-Safety Commissioner was trying to do with the video of the stabbing of the Assyrian bishop. No one is saying, oh, that was a forged video or it didn't really happen. It happened. And the claim was, well, you know, the regular secretaries and plumbers out there, you're too stupid to actually look at this stuff and get a proper reaction. I mean, disgraceful. And so I didn't like that at all. most of the objectionable stuff that the E-Safety Commissioner does is usually more in the realm of opinions. If you're in the straight out realm of fact, like no one denies that Albanese was a trot, I don't think they're going to censor that, to be honest.
Look, in the end of the day, these sort of laws that suppress free speech, they are instruments of bigotry, of intolerance from the side of those who claim to be the most tolerant ones. So one thing that I have noticed in my life is that the most intolerant people are those who claim to be tolerant. So that's a very interesting aspect. And when I started my career here in Australia, my main topic was vilification law. And then I realized that the threshold was so low, that was about offendedness and people feeling offended, that guess what? The more intolerant a person is, the more he or she feels offended. So rather than actually being about protecting us from bigotry and intolerance, the law itself is an instrument of intolerance and bigotry.
So, as this is the last question, let me finish with this. It's in honor of Augusto, who has just become engaged, so I think we can congratulate him. It is for the third time, so. Now, I'll finish with this little story of the two. They're quite conservative, and they've been dating for some time, and you know, they're quite socially conservative, and finally the young lady says to the young fellow, I think I'm ready to take our relationship to the next level. So he's pretty excited about that, but she says, but first I'd like you to come and meet my parents. And then after that, we can go back to your place. And so, you know, he spends the whole week, he buys flowers for the girls, buys chocolates, I think this would be great. And on the way to get her on the Friday night, he stops at the chemist and he says, I need some condoms. And the chemist says, you want 2, 4, 6? He said, give me 6, it'll be a great night. And picks up the girl, and they drive to her parents' house, and they get ushered in right away to dinner. And he volunteers to say grace, and he says the most turgid, lengthy grace. It goes on forever. When he's finally done, the girl leans over and she whispers, I didn't know you were so religious. And he leans over and goes, yeah, I didn't know your dad was a chemist. Thank you, everybody.
Righto, ladies and gentlemen, we're very near the end. When Augusto suggested that the Civilisationists asked Professor Allan to speak, 2 dates were suggested, the 15th of May and today. But if it wasn't to be the 15th, the 29th of May would be extremely difficult, but he would do it. Well, we couldn't do the 15th. So poor Professor Allan had said he would come here. And I'll tell you why it was difficult. It's not only a day to fly here, a day to be here, and a day to get back, which is a lot out of the schedule. But having got back, he's at home for a day, and he's off to a month in America. And Mrs. Allan is not impressed. So I think we really have to say to him, thank you so much for coming and putting up with this. And we'll all apologise to your wife, who we've never met. Now, James, in this little bag is not a bottle of wine. No. There are 2 books. One is even about Queensland. And the other one is a paper, academic, which you asked for. And it was, in fact, the second last, because this was nearly the last straw, and the next paper written was the last straw of Marion's academic career at UWA, or the satire. So, it is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And the trouble is that Augusto being a West Australian, we know him quite well, all he's going to get is a seriously big hand clap. Like many of you, I have been feeling somewhat ashamed about my country. No warships to the Red Sea, debilitating IR law, the absolute disgrace going on at the university with the government over Israel, and even the fact that we have to have a seminar on misinformation. So I thought, what are we going to do about this? And I said, we should have a seminar on what is great about our country, rather than everything which is bad at the moment. And we are the world leaders in mining and agriculture. And these two industries are the backbone of Australia. So I thought that I had a really great idea. We'd have a seminar called Pride, pride in my country, and anger, some of you picked it, and anger at the roadblocks the government puts on these industries. And as some of you have picked, there was a small problem with the word pride. One can get depressed. So, I don't know what we're going to call it, but the next seminar we have will be about mining and agriculture. There will be an introduction from the National Mining Day by Gina Reinhardt. That will be a video one. And we have 2 or 3 great speakers, one of whom is very near the front here, is here tonight, and I hope you will join us then. So now, the formal session is over, the bar will be open, with some very good coffee and cakes, and please talk to everyone, including the speakers, and thank
And
you.
Joe,
One more point, most important, please remove your name tags. We're an impoverished organisation and leave money there.
Yep, and Joe, video of this and other previous Civilisations events is on freedomactivism.com, and Joe and Marion will pass the link out in due course. Yes, thank you. Yep.
Thank you. So, thank you for coming.